think that turntablism is possibly one of the most misunderstood hobbies that I can think of. It's a niche within a niche, possibly within another niche. And I got into it around 2004, and I think even by then it had already had its heyday. Like most people from the UK who got into it around the time I did, I discovered it through any DVDs I could get my hands on, music forums, and any of the scant YouTube videos that were available at the time. And this all resulted in a lot of confusion and misconceptions that I had around the art form. So today I'm going to talk about 6 things that I wish I knew about turntablism before I started doing it. I'll be focusing mostly on scratching purely because that's what I've spent the most of my time on over the years, for better or for worse. So scratching is hard. Don't be lured into thinking that scratching is just a party trick for DJs. It's actually an incredibly difficult and nuanced instrument. Grand Mixer DST or DXT said it better than I can.
It's still about touch and velocity and rhythm and timing. All of that still applies or it won't work. So you have to play it. You have to shed like any other instrument to develop that touch. And it is one of the most intricate techniques that you can do as far as splitting your brain, as far as time is concerned.
You have to put the same amount of effort into learning to scratch as you do any other musical instrument, which may be a surprise to some people. On top of this, there are a few other key differences. The turntable is a relatively new instrument, and the language of turntablism and scratching is getting more developed recently, but compared to other traditional instruments that have literally centuries of history behind them, the turntable is still well within its infancy. Scratching is also generally an improvised medium. There are no songs that you can just go out and learn, and to get better you kind of have to figure it out yourself as you go. On top of this, copying other people's routines is also considered biting. So yeah, you don't have the luxury of learning songs or routines as a learning process like you do with other instruments. So like any instrument, it's going to take literally years of solid practice until you're actually any good, and maybe even longer than traditional musical instruments for the reasons that I listed above. It has endless possibilities. So the turntable is like this weird sci-fi instrument where you make music by manipulating other sounds that people have created. And this is awesome because you potentially have any sound ever pressed to wax available to play with. I think the art of digging for records and samples is becoming a bit of a lost one. I know that a lot of us, myself included, are happy with a few battle records and some scratch loopers to cut over. This is a bit of a two-dimensional way of approaching the turntable when I really stop to think about it. And there's very few people who can only scratch and pull it off effectively. I'm looking at you, DJ Q-bert. When I look back, I wish I'd pushed my limits a bit further with digging for samples, learning beat juggling, and just generally making routines. Essentially, seeing what I could do musically with the instrument. The turntable's strengths are also its weaknesses. All the things that make the turntable cool can also kind of make it difficult to work with. Sure, you can scratch any sample under the sun, but you might not always have the correct sample to hand, which makes being spontaneous difficult at times. Seeing other musicians improvise and jam out together has made me feel quite jealous at times in the past. Sure, DJs can integrate with other instruments, but there's a certain degree of planning required for this to happen. Often we're just left scratching over the top of other instruments, either as fills or a bit of a gimmick, rather than being an essential part of the music. Of course, there are examples where this isn't the case, such as Mr. Switch's Turntable Concerto, but the difference here is that they probably had to plan the concerto all around the turntable. This left me with a kind of love-hate relationship with scratching over the years. I could legit see myself playing piano and making music when I'm 60, for instance, but scratching, I'm not so sure. My tendons certainly don't think so. So before you start going down this path, just be sure that you know what you're really getting yourself into and that you explore all of the options available to you. The general public don't care these days. So I used to have ideas that when I started busting out cuts at a gig, I'd get rapturous applause afterwards. And frankly, it's just not the case. At least not for me anyway. When you scratch at the majority of gigs, the only people who seem to care are really the other DJs, and they might give you the odd cheer or even a fist bump at the end of the set. I'm sure you know this already, but the fact of the matter is, when you're playing music at a normal bar or club, most people are just there to listen to the music or to dance. I like to throw in some scratching to keep myself entertained, and it's normally just an intro from a song that I'm already mixing. When I have dared to bust out the battle record and chuck on an R and a fresh, There's not really been too much of a reaction, I'm afraid. But the better you are, the more that you can kind of match your cuts to the music. And this can actually mean that people don't even know you're the one doing the cuts and they think it's part of the song. You actually have to apply your new skill. So I touched on this just now, and I think it's a really important one, so I'm going to attack it from a slightly different angle. I've literally spent years and years practicing scratching, trying to get better and better. But at the end of it, sometimes I'm kind of left thinking, why? Scratching can take many different forms. For example, you can do cuts on a mixtape, or hooks for songs, be part of a band as I mentioned before, make loop-based music or turntable music, enter battles, or you could just be like a solo scratcher, kind of like DJ Q-bert. These are all great reasons to scratch, and I've been lucky enough to experiment with a few of them. But I often wish I'd pushed my boundaries a little bit more. Being a solo scratcher is the one I'd be wary of. I've seen plenty of people just stop scratching after a number of years. And I guess it's due to the law of diminishing returns. The better you get at scratching, the harder and harder it becomes to improve. And when you realise you're not ever going to get as good as Q-bert, it's easy to just get disheartened and stop practicing at all. I guess your passion might just fizzle out. From my observations, the people who continue cutting are the ones who enter battles, join bands, put on their own events, and all that kind of stuff. The more you put in, the more you get out, I guess is the phrase here. I've gone long periods where I didn't even want to practice scratching at all. Ironically, making this channel has made me practice regularly again, and I guess that highlights my point quite well. I'm not saying that you should draw your motivation from some bullshit reasons like money or fame or anything like that, but it does help to have some kind of goal or just another thing which is kind of pushing you in the right direction. So what's my point? Don't forget to actually do something with the new skill you're learning. Which kind of leads me to my next point, which is that community helps. When you're out scratching away on your own, it can be difficult to get new ideas and to stay motivated. I live in London, and luckily we've built up a pretty cool community around scratching now. We've been running the Super Scratch Sunday event for a few years now. Well, oh my God, almost 10, I think. And there's communities like Scratch Link Up and Up to Scratch, which are putting on regular meetups. However, in contrast to this, when I first started scratching, I barely knew anyone I could cut with. If you don't live in a big city, it's going to be pretty difficult to find other people to actually cut with, which is a shame because when you're learning, that's probably the best thing you can be doing for your progress. Luckily, there's loads of awesome resources and communities online for scratching now. The Turntable Training Wax Tiny Chat, for example, or the Turntablist community over on Reddit. But nothing beats cutting with people in person. When you do finally get to have a cut with people, it's awesome, and a high percentage of my mates are now actually all DJs, and it's great having like-minded people to hang out with, geek out about scratching, beat making, and music in general. So the last one is don't forget about the DJing element of turntablism and scratching. And I've found this one quite hard to put into words, but I've noticed a trend of people scratching over weird-ass beats that people have found on loopers. And again, I'm not excluded from this. You've probably noticed this trend too, and I guess it makes sense that DJs want to scratch over looper beats as they're stripped back and they often have some pretty cool rhythms of scratching over. Yeah, they're really great for practicing, but I often stop and think, would I ever be listening to this beat if I wasn't scratching over it? And for the majority of the beats, I think that no, I probably wouldn't, and you've got to kind of approach it from a listener's perspective. When they hear you scratching over those beats, they think that that's the music that you're into, and it's kind of like a weird sort of phenomenon, I suppose. As I say, I'm not really sure where I'm going with this one, but it's certainly something that I've thought about, and yeah, I'd be really interested to know what your comments on that are. That's it, guys. Don't forget to drop a like, and here are some other videos about scratching and turntablism. Peas and carrots, guys.